Welcome to Atheists Talk. My name is James Zimmerman. I'm going to be your host today. Today we're going to be talking about the topic, the Christianity of America. This is part two in a two-part discussion. Earlier we discussed the founding of our nation. Was it founded on Christian principles, the Ten Commandments, things like that? Now we're going to take a look at the modern age, how Christian is our nation compared with different points in the past. I have with me two panel members, Ryan Sutter and Jack Caravela. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's get right in on it. I kind of divided the history of the nation up into a few chunks here, and I wanted to compare the current era, this century, with those different points in the past. And first off, let's ask ourselves a question: is America more or less Christian now than it was during the time of the founding fathers, say during the time of the first 4 or 5 presidents?
Well, I'd point out that during the time of our founding fathers, it was estimated that only 10 to 15% of people living in the colonies at that time belonged to a church, and most of them were women, remembering that women didn't have much opportunity to speak and to be heard in
vote
in governmental circles. So as far as that is concerned, I would imagine church membership is quite a bit above that now. But you also have to think about how people express their religious feelings, and how many people today who call themselves Christian fail to even be able to tell you the names of the 4 Gospels. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of religious illiteracy today too, and maybe this is the era of greater religious lip service than back then, but people during the Enlightenment age and increased literacy, when people could read their own Bible, there was a renewed interest, and people probably knew more about mm-hmm. their religions, I'm guessing, back then.
I think that's a very good point, that the religiosity was very different back then, and mm-hmm. How you compare today's age versus then is very different metrics that you might use. Church attendance, maybe not such a great metric, but you have to think at a time, before Darwin, before a lot of understanding of how science and the universe works, things that we've discovered now. At that point, everybody pretty much believed in God. I mean, there were people who were philosophically stood in the atheist position, but I think religiosity was a totally different thing. I think it was just very hard to quantify, and so different from our current environment, and what we think of as Christian today is so different than what was Christian mm-hmm. then. That it's a difficult comparison to make in terms of which one was more Christian.
I was wondering how we would be able to compare it, because they couldn't track things as well back then. If you lived 10 miles from a church in the year 1800, you maybe just didn't go because it was so far.
Right.
Now it'd be difficult to find an American who doesn't have access to a church.
Mm-hmm.
And also we seem to know a lot more about each other's lives now with mm-hmm. technology and the internet. So we know, they know how many people are on church rosters. They can all report to a common organization that can do surveys to see how much different denominations have risen and fallen through the years. But there's not as good of a way to know, like in the Missouri territory, how many people were attending some church that a guy built in his backyard.
And their priorities in life would have been a lot different too. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you're settling a continent, you might really firmly believe in God, and you might even think God is helping you settle that continent. But your priorities are staying alive, mm-hmm. Building cities and farms and doing that, basic fundamental work, and then of course killing all the Indians.
Right. Took a lot of faith.
Well, yeah. So I think they were probably fairly fervently religious at the time, just very differently religious.
I think that's an accurate assessment. We talked a lot about them in the first half of the show too. So let's maybe move on to a little bit more modern. When we compare our current era to, say, the post-Civil War era, is a little bit more modern. The United States is about the size it is now by this point. Mm-hmm. When we look at the Gilded Age, what do you think? Were the people of that time period more or less religious, specifically talking about Christianity?
Well, if I could back up a little bit,
Yep,
because before that era you had the abolitionist movement and the temperance movement and the suffragists. And
They started before the Civil War, is what you're saying, right?
yeah, in terms of asserting the
Okay.
rights of women. And often those were combined in different ways. So the abolitionists, religious people, like to claim the credit for the abolition of slavery. Only when you look at history, it's not true, because the northern clergy did not speak out forcefully against slavery for quite a long time, and they were more interested in godlessness, and they were so threatened by the French Revolution. That was their main cause. So, and there were many Christians who would heckle the abolitionist speakers. And this is something that we'll see through history. The religious people who were abolitionists had a deep sense of social justice that sometimes, but not always, is connected to religion, because the opposite is true when it comes to discrimination against people of different faiths, which was rampant during the time of the founders and continued. And that's one area that has gotten better, but some unlikely bedfellows have emerged, which we'll talk about later too. But when we go back to the abolitionists and the temperance movement, the temperance movement and suffragists, we'll go on a little about that later. But the Gilded Age that you brought up, I would mention, is also considered kind of the golden age of free thought as well. That's when Robert Ingersoll, the great agnostic, was speaking to packed houses on religious doubt and the superiority of reason. So there was a great opportunity for people to listen to other points of view other than their own, and they did that, which unfortunately may be more lost today.
Yeah. That seemed like an era of contrast. We had Ingersoll and Darwin on the one hand, Marx, but there was also, like you mentioned, the abolitionists, the progressives, people who saw the social ills that were coming because of the urbanization of America, and the influx of immigrants was enormous back then.
Well, there's another angle to that too, which is that time period was when American Christian life was experiencing what is referred to as the Third Great Awakening, which we've already glossed over the First and Second Great Awakenings, but
they weren't as great. We established it was so tough to
to awaken
to compare that time period to now.
Well, but still, in the mid 1700s. There was a sense that the religious fervor of the Puritans and the Pilgrims and those was flagging, and there was a new sort of movement that swept through, and people became really religiously motivated and building a lot of churches and getting a lot of Bibles, and then that flagged off a little bit, and then another kind of big movement came through in between like 1790 and the early 1800s. And it was out of, those, when that sort of started to fade off, this Third Great Awakening happened, and this was about the same time that the Third Great Awakening was, I think, in large part, a reaction. I'm not quite sure what the Second Great Awakening was reacting to, but the Third Great Awakening was really kind of reacting to this rise in free thought, that there were these chautauquas, which are these sort of big tents where they would do these big, revival meetings, and people would show up and they would sit under these tents for days, and they'd travel across the prairies, and they would, people would come along, and for some people that was the only entertainment they had. That was the big, and that was where some of the indigenously American, not Native American, but religious organizations began, was the Millerite movement that came out of the Third Great Awakening, led to the Adventists, the Jehovah's Witnesses. The Mormons came out of that same time period. So there was a lot of religious fervor, but it's almost always like waxed and waned. It's been in response to the fact that the last big push kind of died out, and then something happens in the Civil War, Darwin, all these things, and then there's another big push, and then that sort of holds its momentum for a while, and so by the time we get to the Gilded Age here, and we're already at the third big wave of American religiosity that's already going to be cresting and kind of dying off a little bit coming into the 20th century.
Although I think sometimes it's misleading to call these great awakenings when you consider the percentage of the population that follow these particular faiths. So it's really very small.
True.
When you consider Mormons,
out of the
Jehovah's
Mormons and
Witnesses.
Jehovah's Witnesses.
Right.
But even that is a movement that, or those specific religions came out of larger Baptist, Congregationalist, and other.
And those are the ones from that time that are still around. I remember reading that if you lived in upstate New York during the Gilded Age and you were a wealthy man and you did not found a religion, that you kind of were a loser. Because it's like everybody was doing it, you know, like how everybody has a two-car garage now. You know, it was just the thing everybody was
That's
doing.
how that area became known as the burned over district. It was like religious revival after religious revival until people got just sick of it. And but nationwide though, you know, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the religious, in general, as society is progressing, religiosity has a tendency to wane as people are more involved in worrying about political or social causes, or they learn more, and so it requires you always get these sort of rounds of preachers who go out and say we've got to get everybody back
to that,
going
yeah.
again. You know?
Well, the author Susan Jacoby advances kind of a theory that religion seems to renew itself in times of trouble, and you always see calls for the government to recognize religion during wars and also natural disasters and cholera epidemics and so forth. So that's certainly an element in religiosity, that people feel adrift and they need something to band together under. And then on the other hand, when there are times of relative prosperity or particularly scientific or intellectual advancement, then that wanes. And she even mentioned we're getting ahead of ourselves, but the Salk vaccine certainly made people trust science more.
Right, they couldn't deny it, yeah.
Right, and evolution, when that Thomas Huxley was coming over during that same period in the Gilded Age, talking about evolution and the wonder of Darwin's theory, that had a great influence too. So it's always hard to characterize an age as religious or non-religious.
True, yeah.
Because both are always going on at the same time.
Like Ryan mentioned the word reaction, like it seemed like with the Gilded Age, there was a reaction to cause these revivals and these new religions that came out of New England, because people saw so much of the progress with, what am I looking for machines and science at that time. They might have been worried that people were leaving God. You know, I remember reading a book about the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, which was a celebration of the 400th anniversary of Columbus landing in this hemisphere. And people looked at that with great awe. It was almost like a mecca to United States industrialism. But at the same time, there were groups there who had their tents and their pavilions where they were trying to push things that brought people close to God, such as they were shooting for the prohibition of alcohol, and some good things, such as the suffrage for women, and better freedoms for the poor. But they also were trying to say, no, turn away from this commercialism, this industrialism that they're saying we should all, in a sense, worship and come back to God.
Well, I find it interesting how there's always a give and take and a back and forth. Like you can look at Darwin and Huxley, and they are working in the realm of biology, but then people start to apply the concepts of survival of the fittest and natural selection to other realms. It becomes sort of an excuse for political and social ideas that are not valid.
You're thinking of social Darwinism?
Social
that term was
Darwinism,
coined during the Gilded
exactly,
Age, yeah.
yes. And what's interesting then is then that becomes the basis for a religious reaction against Darwin. And so what you have is, it's interesting that you have something that evolution and Darwin is something that sort of captivated people at a certain time, and then became a reason for people to be upset. I guess what the point I'm just getting at is that you can trace back the roots of a lot of the modern controversies, a lot of modern situations. Even creationism can be traced back to an Adventist root taking place
Which
at the
started
in this time period. And but it's always reacting. Religions is usually, since since the Enlightenment has been put in the position of reacting to to new advances in information and technology, and then having to redefine and readjust itself in each one of these areas. And so, you know, the actual beliefs of Christianity during the 1800s, late 1800s, changed fairly dramatically. They had to alter a lot of their understandings of what the Bible meant, what it meant to be a Christian, and you know that has been going on continuously.
Yeah. There seems to be a lot of parallels then between that era and now, because a lot of religions seem to be reacting to the technology and the ills that they see around them.
But social Darwinism in particular is a complete, of course, misapplication of
Right,
Darwin's
yeah.
theory.
Thanks for pointing
Absolutely.
that out.
And also, it wasn't always seen as incompatible with religion. There were people who would claim that this is God's plan, and just as we have people who believe in evolution, retain their religion, it was just a matter of taking a new idea and twisting it to their own ends, which is interesting when you consider modern day prosperity theology, which tells you that God wants you to be rich, and if you are rich, that's a sign of God's favor. It's just a parallel to social Darwinism, but just twisted.
Under a new moniker.
Exactly.
All right, let's move a little bit forward in time. Actually, I didn't write down the early part of the 20th century, but I was hoping we could discuss that if you had anything to bring out about, especially the years leading up to and immediately after World War I. What was the religious climate then?
Well, it was an era of scientific progress before World War I, and so some historians say that was an end was put to that enlightened age because of the war, but there was more to it than that, obviously, and more of a backlash. But it was a time when people were kind of open to the idea that society could be structured or guided in a rational way, and it was an exciting time and a time of a lot of new opportunity. And I think it did have a good free thought. It was a good fertile soil for free thought at that time too.
Especially, are you talking now after World War I?
Before, after
right
World War I, I seem to gather that there was something of a backlash and it got off track a little bit, and the exact causes of it, whether it was the war itself or just backlash to the more greater acceptance of Darwinism, for instance, is not clear. But it did change. It waxes and wanes, as Ryan said.
And it was about that time that, and we use the term fundamentalist today, that actually derives from a pamphlet that was published about that time period that was called The Fundamentals. And it was one of these, you know, back to Jesus movement type things that I can't remember the exact denomination that published the pamphlet.
But the idea was the fundamentals
but it
of Christianity,
was the
or of the
fundamentals of
Bible?
Christianity,
Okay.
and it stated a specific core set of Christian beliefs, and that's the origin of the term fundamentalist. It's one who adheres to those specific core sets of beliefs in that particular pamphlet. But it is interesting that, you know, that was I don't think that was paid that much attention to at the time. And as Jack was saying, after World War I, people started rejecting some of these newer ideas of Darwin, and people started to want to pick up more religiosity, and some of those things were just kind of sitting there waiting to be picked up. But you know, I thought that was, when I first learned that was the origin of the term fundamentalist, was that it was actually, well, they were calling themselves that. It was, do you adhere to this pamphlet? You know, that was exactly this time period.
So let's compare the United States presently to one more time period, and that would be World War II to maybe like 1970, that 30-year window there, when we saw things like the fight against the godless communists of the 50s and 60s. I looked up information about Harry Truman, who was president from 1945 to 1953. He wrote in a letter to Pope Pius XII saying, "This is a Christian nation." And later he said, "The fundamental basis of this nation's laws was given to Moses on the Mount. The fundamental basis of our Bill of Rights comes from the teaching we get from Exodus and St. Matthew, from Isaiah and St. Paul." So it certainly seems like the climate was a lot more religious then. Of course, I'm just lifting one quote, but...
Well, it wouldn't be the first or last time that a politician or elected official misread history. And it's such a turbulent era. If you try and consider that time from 1945 to the 70s, because yes, you do have that godless communist scare, and that's when the Pledge of Allegiance was changed.
Right.
So there is that, and there was also, of course, the McCarthy era, when anyone even suspected of being a communist sympathizer was blacklisted, and many people like Burgess Meredith and Aaron Copland and Lena Horne and others had their careers seriously derailed. And we just remember those names because they were able to come back from it. But after that, that was a real witch trial realization, where, like Arthur Miller, for instance, wrote about, and he was a victim of McCarthyism as well. And there was a backlash to that when Edward R. Murrow exposed McCarthy, and people kind of got onto his faults and his exaggerations. And the interesting thing at the same time was when soldiers were coming back from World War II and the GI Bill was passed, then suddenly there was a great need for academics. And a lot of the same people who were vilified during the McCarthy era found themselves employed as teachers, as professors, and so forth. And that, in turn, led to another kind of intellectual awakening, which may have peaked, perhaps, during the Kennedy administration. And Kennedy, unlike Truman, was a strict separationist. And in fact, a quote from Kennedy, if I can find it here, was that he believes that the separation of church and state should be absolute. If you go back and read that speech that he gave to ministers, basically to reassure them that his Catholicism wasn't going to overtake his commitment to being fair and to taking his duties as president in a more secular vein. But that's a very strong speech in terms of secularism. And that's going on, in the early 1960s.
Yeah.
So it's...
You took Kennedy from me. I was going to mention that he had to almost prove that he wasn't going to let his Catholicism get in the way of his decision-making if he was going to win, and he did win.
Right.
But that seems different from now, when people almost have to prove that they are men of faith in order to get a government position. Not officially, of course, because as we mentioned in part one, there can't be a test for religion, but it seems like in order to curry enough votes, people have to say almost the opposite of what Kennedy said.
Right, and it seems to go to some of the politicalization of religion with first the moral majority and then the Christian coalition, which were basically formed, the moral majority, as a political instrument to lobby government and to get their agenda across. So that was a big shift, and it's just a matter of people trying to retain the people who vote religiously on hot button issue topics, of course, like abortion and gay marriage and so forth. Not the social justice issues that some other devout people who were politicians, President Jimmy Carter, for instance, really devoted his religious belief to, the social justice rather than these hot button social issues. So the way religion has been used has been I think very cynical, and it's very patronizing too, and I would hope that religious people would see through that. Apparently not enough so far.
There is, you bring up the social justice issues, and with the civil rights movement in the 1960s, religion was a very, very important part of that. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr., most of the civil rights leaders in the South, they were organizing in churches. They were led as a religious movement in very, very, very large part. And so from that perspective, you had a strong upsurge in religion tied to a political cause that was actually progressive and positive and was based on not so much a test of your religiosity, but based on a set of ideals that they found compatible with Christianity. And it's an interesting, when you're just talking about sort of academically, are we more or less religious? I think what is an interesting thing that came out of the civil rights movement in the 1960s is a very strong definition of two different two different ideas of what it means to be Christian in this country. There's a fairly strong, and to tie it directly to our this recent political presidential election, both candidates at this point in our history, unfortunately, do feel the need to wear God on their sleeve.
Mm-hmm.
But one is attempting to do a sort of a version of Christianity that is a strain that tries to be liberal, inclusive, non-judgmental. There are many different types of Christian groups that have gone this direction. And then there's the idea of, we need to get to the fundamentals and I don't know, the Left Behind books come to mind as a type of, America will be judged for her sins, and, all of these things, Hurricane Katrina being a punishment against.
Right.
So there's two different types of Christianity at this point that are very polarized from each other. And I think a lot of that came out of kind of the social change and upheaval that happened in the 1960s, that you kind of, it wasn't so much people chucking out God and going to atheism, but it was redefining what Christianity meant for them in some pretty remarkably opposite ways, and
I would point out with the civil rights movement, though, Dr. King did not abandon the people who were not Christian. There were a lot of Jewish intellectuals who were very involved, and former socialists who were very involved, and that really, to me, is an Enlightenment era issue. The rights of man, and as we saw in the first episode, right, that's what it's based on, and certainly religion, particularly in the African American community, that was the basic way of organizing. So that was a good way to do it, and it is consistent with Dr. King's theology, but it's not limited to that, and I think it goes beyond that. So whether it was a renaissance for Christianity,
Tough call.
I might, have a tough call against that, because certainly it wasn't for the Southern Baptists, and they're Christian.
Yeah.
True.
Well, it's tough to answer in a lot of time, and actually we're running out of time. But if people want to learn more, Jack, you had a couple books that you could refer people to?
Right. The topic of this show, particularly kind of the history of free thought and religion, is covered very well in Susan Jacoby's book, Free Thinkers. Also, if you go to the archives of the Atheists Talk episodes, you'll find a couple of episodes in which we talk about this book specifically. Okay. Our first show was more about the history of our government, and this book, The Godless Constitution, is a very good survey of that, of the idea of secularism, how it affected the founders.
And the author is?
And the authors, this is Susan Jacoby for
Jacoby,
Free Thought, and this is Isaac Kramnik and Lawrence Moore.
Okay.
I will say something to our atheist audience. They are a bit deferential to religion as maybe a necessary moral instrument, but very good historical survey.
Okay, well, thanks. And thank you for listening. If you contact us at the message on the screen, we'll send you a free copy of our newsletter. If you're interested in us, we're interested in you. Thank you for listening.